He looked at his wife, the woman he once promised to cherish, and handed her the divorce papers. "Sign them," he commanded, his voice cold as ice. He was doing it to save his mistress, the woman he thought was his true love. He believed his wife was a traitor who had tried to ruin him. But years later, when he discovered the truth, that every document she signed, every tear she shed, every piece of her life she gave up was a secret sacrifice to protect him from a devastating secret, his regret became a prison from which he could never escape. If you believe that true sacrifice is the ultimate form of love and that the truth always deserves to be known, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Clara's story of silent strength must be told. The storm that raged outside the panoramic windows of the Zenith Tower seemed a pale imitation of the tempest inside Leo's office. Rain lashed against the glass, 50 stories above the glittering wet streets of Seoul, each drop a tiny hammer against his sanity. Inside the silence was a weapon. Leo, president of the formidable Orion Corporation, stood like a statue carved from granite, his back to the room. His bespoke suit, a shield of power he wore every day, could not hide the rigid tension in his shoulders. On the polished obsidian of his desk, a single folder lay open. It contained evidence, emails, encrypted messages, bank transfers, all pointing to an act of corporate treason that threatened to undo a decade of his life's work. And all of it, every last damning piece of data, was traced back to one person, his wife, Clara. The door opened with a soft, deferential click. Clara entered, her face etched with a quiet concern that would soon be replaced by sheer terror. She was holding a small thermos. "I brought you some tea," she said, her voice soft, a gentle melody in the harsh, silent room. "You've been working so late. I was worried." She placed the thermos on a side table, her movements graceful and full of a love he no longer believed he deserved or even wanted. For the past year, their marriage had been a cold and distant affair, an arrangement of convenience that had long since lost any warmth. But he knew, on some level, that she still cared for him in her quiet way. That knowledge only made the betrayal feel sharper, more personal. "I don't want tea," he said, turning slowly to face her. The cold fury in his eyes made her take an involuntary step back. "I want an explanation." He gestured to the open folder on his desk. "Tell me, Clara, how much did they pay you?" The question was so out of left field, so nonsensical, that she could only stare at him in confusion. "Pay me? For what?" "Leo, I don't understand." "Don't you?" he sneered, a sound ugly and foreign in the pristine office. He strode to the desk, snatched a printed email from the folder and thrust it at her. "Our competitor, Helios International, just launched a product that is identical to our Project Chimera. A project so secret that only 5 people in the entire world had access to the full data. You were one of them. And this," he shook the paper in her face, "is an email from an anonymous account traced back to a server you used on our home network, offering them our entire research and development portfolio." Clara's world tilted on its axis. She took the paper, her hands trembling as she read the words. It was all there, a fabrication so perfect, so detailed, that it was almost believable. But she knew instantly who was behind it. Serena, her cousin and Leo's mistress, a woman whose ambition was matched only by her cunning. Serena had been visiting their home frequently, always with a smile and a poisoned compliment. She must have used her computer, cloned her credentials, planted this evidence with meticulous care. But why? Clara's mind raced, and then the horrifying truth dawned on her. This wasn't just about corporate espionage, it was about possession. Serena wanted Leo all to herself, and Clara was the only obstacle. "This wasn't me," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with desperation, pleading with him. "Leo, you have to believe me. I would never... I love..." "Don't," he cut her off, his voice a lethal hiss. "Don't you dare say that word to me." He pulled another document from the folder, a bank statement showing a deposit of $1 million into an offshore account set up in her name. A masterful forgery. "Serena was the one who discovered this," he continued, and the mention of her name on his lips was another twist of the knife. "She was worried about you, about how distant you've been. She hired a private investigator to make sure you were okay, And this is what he found. She's heartbroken, Clara. You've betrayed us all. The irony was so bitter, so profoundly unjust, that Clara almost choked on it. Serena, the architect of this ruin, was being painted as the heroine. It was her, Clara said, her voice finding a sliver of strength. Serena did this. She's framing me. Leo, think. She wants you. She wants me out of the way. Leo laughed, a humorless, broken sound. So, now you're accusing the woman who saved my company, the woman who exposed you. You are even more pathetic than I thought. He turned away from her, walking back to the window and looking down at the city he had conquered. When he spoke again, his voice was devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a judge passing sentence. I spoke with my lawyers. They advised me to press charges to make an example of you. But Serena, she begged me not to. She said it would create a public scandal that would hurt the company. And you, he turned back, his face a mask of stone. She asked me to be merciful. He walked to his desk and pulled a different folder from a drawer. He opened it on the desk, revealing divorce papers. This is my mercy, he said. You will sign these papers tonight. You will waive any right to my assets, my name, everything. You will walk out of my life with nothing but the clothes on your back. In return, I will not send you to prison for what you did. It was a choice between a prison of steel and a prison of poverty and shame. He was offering her exile as a kindness. He was forcing her to divorce him to save the very woman who had orchestrated the entire plot. He was choosing his mistress, a venomous snake, over his loyal wife. The pain of it was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest, with tears streaming down her face, tears of grief not for her marriage, but for the man she thought he was. She picked up the pen. Her signature was a shaky, jagged line, the final heartbeat of her old life. Now get out, he said, not even looking at her, and I never want to see your face again. If this injustice breaks your heart, comment injustice. The divorce was a quiet, brutal amputation. Clara left the Zenith Tower that night and never returned. She walked out into the rain, a ghost leaving a life that was no longer hers. In the days that followed, the efficiency of Leo's machine was terrifying. Her belongings arrived at her parents' small apartment in neatly packed boxes. Her name was removed from every account, every membership, every trace of her existence in his world, scrubbed clean. The world of the elite, which had never truly accepted her, now acted as if she had never existed at all. Leo, true to his word, did not press charges. Instead, he allowed a carefully curated story to leak to the financial press. A quiet, amicable divorce due to irreconcilable differences. In the same news cycle, it was announced that Serena had been promoted to vice president of Orion Corporation, a reward for her unwavering loyalty and sharp business acumen. The world saw a seamless transition. Only Clara knew the bloody truth of the coup that had taken place. Her exile was not in a distant country, but in the suffocating familiarity of her old life, now tainted with failure and shame. Her parents, a quiet, loving couple who ran a small bookstore, welcomed her home without question, but she could see the confusion and pain in their eyes. She had been their Cinderella, their daughter who had married a prince. Now she was back in her old room, a princess in rags, the fairy tale shattered. The first few months were a blur of grief. She mourned not the loss of luxury, but the loss of her own identity. Who was she, if not Leo's wife? Who was she, if not the woman who had tried so hard to build a bridge to a man's heart, only to have him detonate it? The rebirth of Clara was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, agonizing process, like a broken bone knitting itself back together in the dark. It began with anger, a cold, hard anger that replaced the grief. An anger at Serena for her treachery, but also a deeper, more complex anger at Leo. Not just for believing the lies, but for his blindness, for never having seen her, truly seen her, in the first place. This anger became her fuel. She realized that to truly be free of him, she couldn't just exist in the margins of her old life. She had to build something new, something that was entirely her own, something that his name and his world could never touch. The secret that she held, the one thing she hadn't revealed during their final confrontation, became the cornerstone of her new life. She knew why Leo had protected Serena. She knew about the secret that tied them together, the dark foundation upon which Orion Corporation was built. Years ago, before Leo took over, his father had acquired a small tech startup through means that were legally grey, essentially stealing the core technology that would become the basis for Orion's success. The original inventor, a brilliant but disgraced programmer, had disappeared. Serena, in her previous role, had been the one to unearth the proof of this original sin. She held the documents that could expose the entire Orion empire as being built on a lie, a theft. That was her leverage over Leo. Clara understood that Leo hadn't chosen Serena out of love. He had chosen her out of fear. He was protecting his father's legacy, protecting his company. And in his mind, sacrificing his traitor wife was a small price to pay. This knowledge transformed Clara's mission. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, not just for herself, but for all the people that titans like Leo and Serena crushed on their way to the top. She sold the last of her valuable jewelry, the pieces from her grandmother that she had managed to keep, and used the money not to live, but to learn. She enrolled in online law courses, focusing on corporate ethics and intellectual property rights. The woman who once read poetry now read legal precedents. The hands that once played the piano now highlighted case files. She became a voracious student of the very system that had failed her. After 3 years of relentless study and saving every penny she earned from working part-time at her parents' bookstore, she did something audacious. She started a small, non-profit foundation. She called it the Aegis Foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide anonymous legal aid and investigative resources to whistleblowers and victims of corporate malfeasance. She operated from a tiny rented office above a noodle shop, her only staff a semi-retired idealistic lawyer who was tired of the corporate grind. She became a ghost, a protector in the shadows. She took on small cases at first, helping employees who were wrongfully dismissed, inventors whose ideas were stolen by large corporations. She never put her own name forward. She was just Aegis, and she was getting good at it. She was learning how to fight giants. The trigger for her return to Leo's world came in the form of an anonymous email. It was from a programmer who claimed his life's work had been stolen by Orion Corporation years ago. He had been financially ruined and legally silenced, but he still had the proof. Clara's heart stopped. It was him, the original inventor, the ghost upon whose stolen work Orion was built. Her past and present had just collided. She knew this was the case that would lead her back to Leo. But this time she wouldn't be his wife. She would be his judge. For Leo, the 5 years since the divorce had been a golden age of expansion and conquest. With Serena by his side as his ruthlessly efficient vice president, Orion Corporation had solidified its dominance in the tech industry. They were the perfect power couple, their professional synergy praised in every financial journal. Serena was his fortress, his most trusted advisor, the keeper of his company's original sin, and the co-conspirator in maintaining its pristine public image. He had long since buried the memory of Clara, convincing himself that the divorce was a necessary, if unpleasant, act of corporate hygiene. He thought of her rarely, and when he did, it was with a detached pity, picturing her living a small, quiet life, utterly irrelevant to the grand stage on which he now operated. The stage for their re-encounter was set not in a boardroom but in a neutral arbitration center, a bland beige building designed for conflict resolution. Orion Corporation was facing a minor but irritating lawsuit. A small non-profit foundation called Aegis had brought a case on behalf of a programmer, a man named Julian Croft, who claimed that the foundational code for Orion's flagship operating system, Aura, had been stolen from him over a decade ago by Leo's father. The claim was audacious, a ghost from the past that Leo and Serena had worked hard to keep buried. Leo saw it as a nuisance, an attempt at extortion. He decided to attend the initial mediation himself, a show of force to intimidate this small, upstart foundation and make the problem disappear quickly. He and Serena walked into the conference room, their combined presence designed to radiate power. They sat on one side of the long table, flanked by their legal team. They waited for the representatives from the Aegis Foundation. Leo was already impatient. his mind on a dozen more important deals. The door opened, and a quiet, unassuming man in his late 60s entered, introducing himself as Mr. Alistair, the Foundation's legal counsel. He sat down opposite them. "My colleague will be joining us shortly," he said, his voice calm. Seconds later, the door opened again. The woman who entered was not who Leo expected. He had braced himself for a firebrand activist or a hungry young lawyer. The woman who walked in was elegant, poised, and radiated a quiet, unshakable confidence that instantly commanded the room's attention. She wore a simple, dark grey suit. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, professional style, and her eyes, when they swept across the room, were sharp and analytical. And they were familiar. Leo's breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to slow down, the ambient noise of the room fading to a dull hum. It was Clara, but it wasn't. It was the ghost of her, remade into someone entirely new. The gentle softness was gone, replaced by a steely composure. The pleading vulnerability he remembered from their last meeting had been supplanted by an authority that was as natural as breathing. The woman he had dismissed as a fragile piece of porcelain had returned as a diamond, beautiful but unbreakable. Next to him, Serena let out a small, sharp gasp, a sound of pure shock. The ghost from her past, the woman she had so thoroughly defeated and discarded, was back, and she was not a victim seeking pity. She was the opposition. Clara walked to the table with a calm, measured pace. She did not look at Leo. She did not acknowledge his existence. She placed her leather briefcase on the table, opened it, and took out a single file. She addressed the mediator at the head of the table, her voice clear, steady, and professional. "My name is Clara. I am the founder and director of the Aegis Foundation, representing our client, Mr. Julian Croft." Leo could not tear his eyes away from her. His mind, usually a supercomputer of strategic thought, was struggling to process the impossible data before him. The wife he had exiled. The woman he believed was working in a bookstore. The head of the foundation that was threatening to expose his company's foundational lie. How? The question hammered in his brain. The sheer force of will required for such a transformation was beyond his comprehension. The mediation began, and Leo's shock only deepened. Clara was brilliant. She was not just competent, she was masterful. She laid out the case for her client with a calm, logical precision that was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. She presented evidence, fragments of code, old emails, time-stamped server logs that even his own team thought were lost forever, weaving them into an undeniable narrative of theft and cover-up. She never raised her voice, never showed a flicker of personal emotion. She simply presented the facts, each one a perfectly aimed blow against the fortress of Orion's defense. At one point, Orion's lead counsel, a famously aggressive lawyer, tried to dismiss her. "With all due respect," he said with a condescending sneer, "you're the head of a small charity. What can you possibly understand about the complexities of intellectual property law at this level?" Clara met his gaze without blinking. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "I understand that the truth is not determined by the size of one's office," she replied, her voice soft but cutting. "And I understand that a stolen foundation, no matter how tall the building you construct on top of it, is still a stolen foundation. Shall we return to the evidence?" She disarmed him, humiliated him, with a single quiet sentence. And throughout the entire 2-hour meeting, she never once made eye contact with Leo. She treated him as if he were an inanimate object in the room, a piece of furniture. His power, his presence, his entire identity meant nothing to her. And for a man like Leo, being rendered irrelevant was a fate worse than defeat. The meeting ended with the mediator calling for a recess, the Orion legal team visibly shaken. As everyone began to pack up, Leo, driven by an impulse he couldn't control, stood up and walked around the table toward her. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse. She finally looked at him. For the first time in 5 years, their eyes met. But the warmth, the love, the pain he remembered were gone. Her eyes were now like a placid frozen lake, concealing unknowable depths. "Mr. Leo," she replied, the formal title a deliberate, calculated strike. "If you wish to discuss a settlement, please have your legal team contact Mr. Alistair. We only communicate through official channels." Without another glance, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there, his world tilting on its axis. The woman he thought he had erased had just declared war, and a cold, terrifying obsession began to take root in his heart. The initial mediation was not an end, but the opening salvo in a grueling war of attrition. Clara, through the Aegis Foundation, refused any quiet settlement offer. She was not after money. She was after a public acknowledgement of the theft, a formal apology to Julian Croft, and the establishment of a fund financed by Orion to help other inventors fight corporate predation. Her demands were not financial. They were moral, which made them infinitely more difficult for Leo to combat. The case was forced into a protracted discovery phase, a series of legally mandated meetings where both sides were required to exchange information. It was a process designed to expose the truth, and Leo found himself trapped in a fight on a battlefield where the truth was his greatest enemy. He insisted on leading Orion's negotiation team personally. His lawyers, and especially Serena, advised against it. They argued it was beneath a president to be involved in the minutiae of such a case, but Leo was adamant. He told them it was to show strength, to manage the crisis directly, but the real reason was much simpler. He was obsessed. The meetings were the only way he could be in the same room as Clara. He needed to be near the fire that threatened to consume him, to understand the woman who had risen from the ashes he had created. Their weekly meetings became a high-stakes chess match. The conference room was their board, the legal documents their pieces. Leo would enter each session with a new strategy, trying to use his immense corporate power to overwhelm her. He would bury her team in terabytes of irrelevant data, hoping to exhaust their limited resources. He would use his intimidating presence, his voice a low, commanding rumble, trying to provoke an emotional reaction from her. But every move he made, she had already anticipated. She would counter his data dumps with a single, perfectly targeted request for a document she knew he couldn't provide without incriminating himself. She would meet his intimidation with an unnerving, placid calm, her composure a shield he could not penetrate. This intellectual combat began to change him. The frustration and rage he felt were slowly being tainted by a grudging respect. He had never met a mind that could match his own in strategy and foresight. The fact that this mind belonged to the woman he had so easily discarded was a source of constant, irritating cognitive dissonance. He found himself watching her, not just as an adversary, but as a phenomenon. He noticed the small things. The way she would tap her pen once sharply before making a critical point. The subtle shift in her posture when she knew she had him cornered. The way she could command the attention of the entire room without ever raising her voice. And a dangerous, unwanted attraction began to grow. It was not the simple desire for a beautiful woman. It was a complex fascination with her power, her intellect, her sheer, indomitable will. Serena, watching this unfold from her seat beside Leo, was consumed by a growing panic. She saw the way Leo's eyes lingered on Clara. She saw the flicker of respect in his expression after Clara had masterfully dismantled one of their arguments. She, more than anyone, knew the precarious foundation upon which their power was built. Clara was not just a legal threat, she was an existential one. Desperate to regain control, Serena decided to play dirty. She used her considerable influence and a network of shadowy contacts to leak a story to a notoriously vicious financial blog. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It didn't focus on the legal case, it focused on Clara. Using her divorce from Leo as a starting point, it painted her as a scorned, vengeful ex-wife, a woman consumed by bitterness who had started a sham foundation with the sole purpose of destroying the man who had left her. It insinuated that her client, Julian Croft, was a pawn in her personal vendetta. It was a calculated attempt to reframe the narrative from a story of corporate justice to one of a woman scorned. When the article broke, Leo's legal team was jubilant. "This is it," his lead lawyer said. "This is the angle we've been looking for. We can petition the court to have her removed as counsel, citing personal bias and a clear conflict of interest. We can discredit her entire case." They all looked at Leo, expecting him to give the order. But Leo just stared at the screen, at the picture of Clara accompanying the article. He felt a surge of white-hot fury. It was a cheap, cowardly attack. It trivialized her intelligence, her years of hard work, reducing her to a petty emotional stereotype, and it infuriated him. "No," Leo said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We're not touching this." He turned to his head of public relations. "I want you to issue a statement. A statement from Orion Corporation, declaring that while we dispute the legal claims of the Aegis Foundation, we recognize its director as a formidable and professional opponent, and we condemn any ad hominem attacks against her, and find out who leaked this story." Now, Serena went pale. He was defending her. He was actively shielding his greatest enemy from attack. He didn't understand it himself, but the thought of winning this fight through any means other than his own merit, against her merit, felt like a hollow, meaningless victory. The game had changed. He no longer just wanted to defeat her. He wanted to earn her respect. Leo's public defense of Clara sent shockwaves through both their legal teams and became the talk of the financial district. For Clara, the move was deeply unsettling. It was a strategic anomaly she couldn't decipher. Was it a trap? A sophisticated mind game designed to lull her into a false sense of security? Or was it, and this was a far more dangerous thought, a genuine act of respect? The ambiguity of his motives was more destabilizing than his open hostility had ever been. For Serena, it was a terrifying confirmation of her worst fears. Leo was no longer just fighting a lawsuit. He was engaging with Clara on a level that went beyond business. He was captivated by her, and Serena's own position, built on secrets and manipulation, had never felt more precarious. The legal battle raged on, but the atmosphere in the conference room had changed. The overt aggression was replaced by a tense, electric current of unspoken thoughts and shifting allegiances. It was during this period of intense pressure that the past, the very secret Serena and Leo were so desperate to protect, chose to reveal itself in the most mundane and catastrophic way possible: a medical emergency. Leo's father, the patriarch and founder of Orion, had been in a state of declining health for years, living in a secluded, high-end care facility. One evening, he suffered a severe health crisis, a sudden, acute kidney failure that put his life in immediate jeopardy. The doctors at the facility were clear. He needed an immediate kidney transplant to survive. Due to a rare blood type and a complex set of antibodies, finding a donor on the national registry would be impossible in the short time he had left. The only hope was a direct donation from a living relative. Leo was tested immediately, but he was not a match. Panic began to set in. He was the cold, calculating CEO, but the thought of losing his father, the man whose legacy he had fought so hard to protect, brought him to his knees. Desperate, he began to think of other potential family members. It was then that Serena, ever the pragmatist, brought up the unthinkable. "There's Clara," she said, her voice quiet. "She was your wife for 2 years. She was family. We have to ask her." The idea was repugnant to Leo, to go to the woman whose life he had allowed to be ruined, the woman who was now his greatest adversary, and ask her to submit to major surgery to save his father. It was a level of hypocrisy he wasn't sure he could stomach, but the alternative was watching his father die. Swallowing every last bit of his pride, he made the call. He found Clara in her small, modest office above the noodle shop, working late into the night. The contrast between her humble surroundings and the power she now wielded was not lost on him. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid out the situation with a brutal, desperate honesty. His father's condition, the failed match, the ticking clock. He didn't ask her to do it. He didn't demand or plead. He simply told her the truth, his voice devoid of its usual command, leaving only the raw vulnerability of a son about to lose his father. Clara listened in silence, her face unreadable. He expected her to refuse. He expected her to laugh in his face, to savor the moment of his desperation, to tell him that this was her vengeance, delivered by fate. He had prepared himself for her hatred. What he was not prepared for was her response. "I'll do it," she said, her voice calm and even. "I'll get tested. Tell the hospital to expect me in the morning." The days that followed were a surreal blur of medical tests and tense silences. Miraculously, Clara was a perfect match. The doctors called it a 1 in a million chance. The surgery was scheduled immediately. On the morning of the procedure, Leo found her in her hospital room, staring out the window at the rising sun. He was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions he couldn't name. Gratitude, shame, confusion. Why? He finally asked, the single word hanging in the sterile air. Why are you doing this, Clara? After everything. She turned to face him, and for the first time in 5 years, the icy mask of the Aegis Foundation director was gone. He saw a flicker of the old Clara, the gentle, compassionate woman he had once known. Because your father, she said softly, was once kind to me. Before you and I were married, when my own father was sick, he sent his personal doctor to help us, without ever telling anyone. He did it because it was the right thing to do. This, she gestured to the hospital gown she was wearing, is not for you, Leo, it's for him. It's about paying a debt of kindness. The surgery was long and difficult, but successful. Leo's father was saved. Clara, however, suffered a severe, unexpected complication. Due to the stress on her body, she developed a post-operative infection that quickly turned septic. Her condition became critical. She was moved to the intensive care unit, her body fighting for its life. Leo was shattered. The woman who had just saved his father was now dying. He sat outside her ICU room, a helpless vigilante, the irony of the situation, a physical torment. Serena arrived at the hospital, her face a mask of concern. But as they stood there, watching the frantic activity inside Clara's room, a nurse came out looking for Leo. "Mr. Leo," she said, her voice urgent, "we need your consent for an emergency procedure. But there's something you need to see first." Her medical records, they're flagged with a genetic marker, a very rare one. It's linked to her donor profile. We ran it against your family's records and we found a match. Not with your father, but with your mother. Leo stared at her, uncomprehending. "My mother died when I was a child," he said. "Yes," the nurse said, her eyes full of a pained sympathy. "But according to the hospital's birth records from 28 years ago, before she married your father, she gave another child up for a closed adoption. A daughter." The world tilted and then shattered into a million pieces. The nurse handed him a file. He opened it, his hands shaking. Inside was a birth certificate. The mother's name was his mother's, and the child's name, the name given to her by the adoptive family who raised her in a small bookstore, was Clara. Clara wasn't his ex-wife. She wasn't his adversary. She was his sister, the half-sister he never knew he had. And he had just let her sacrifice a part of her body to save the man who had kept her a secret from him his entire life. The secret he'd been protecting wasn't a corporate crime. It was a family lie. And the woman he had thrown away was the only true family he had left. The revelation that Clara was his sister did not just shock Leo, it fundamentally broke him. It was a truth so seismic that it retroactively reframed every interaction, every decision, every cruelty of the past 5 years. His mind, a fortress of logic and calculation, crumbled under the weight of an emotional paradox he could not solve. He had spent years protecting a legacy built on a lie, only to discover the real lie was far more personal and devastating. He had cast out, humiliated, and fought against his own blood. The weight of his ignorance, of his blindness, was a physical thing, a crushing pressure in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He stumbled back from the nurse, the file clutched in his hand, his world a dizzying vortex of sound and light. He looked through the glass window into the ICU, at the woman, his sister, lying amidst a web of tubes and monitors, fighting for her life because of a sacrifice she made for a man who was not even her father by blood, but who was connected to her through a shared history of secrets. The irony was a poison that burned through his veins. His regret was no longer a simple emotion. It was a soul-deep agony, a self-loathing so profound it threatened to consume him entirely. The first casualty of this new, horrifying truth was Serena. She had been standing beside him, her hand on his arm in a gesture of support. But when she saw the look on his face, the utter devastation that went beyond concern for an ex-wife, She knew something had shifted, irrevocably. "What is it?" she asked, her voice sharp with alarm. Leo turned to her, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. He saw her not as his partner or his lover, but as the architect of his greatest sin. She was the one who had woven the web of lies about Clara's treason. She was the one who had stoked his anger, who had encouraged him to be merciless. And she had done it all while knowing, or at least suspecting, the larger game of family secrets that was at play. "You knew," he whispered, the words ragged. "You knew there was more to my father's story. You knew he had secrets. And you used my ignorance to turn me against her." "Leo, that's ridiculous," she began, but the denial was weak, her eyes darting away from his. "I was protecting you, protecting the company." "Get out," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Get out of this hospital, get out of my life. If she doesn't survive this, I will hold you personally responsible. And you will discover what it truly means to lose everything." Serena stared at him, seeing not the powerful CEO she had manipulated, but a man pushed past his breaking point, a man she no longer recognized and now genuinely feared. She turned and walked away, her empire of lies crumbling behind her. Leo's quest for forgiveness began not with words, but with a silent, desperate vigil. He refused to leave the hospital. He sat on the hard plastic chair outside the ICU, a sentry at the gates of his own personal hell. He was the first person the doctors saw in the morning, and the last they saw at night. He learned the names of the nurses, the rhythm of the machines. He read every medical chart, every update, his mind absorbing the complex terminology of his sister's fight for life. He was no longer the president of Orion. He was just a brother, praying for a miracle he knew he didn't deserve. During this time, he did the one thing he should have done years ago. He investigated his own family. He hired the best private investigators, not to find dirt on an enemy, but to unearth the truth of his own past. The story that emerged was one of heartbreak. His mother, from a poor family, had fallen in love with a man her parents disapproved of. She had a child, Clara, whom she was forced to give up for adoption to a kind, childless couple. Years later, a widow and alone, she met Leo's father, a rising businessman who offered her stability, but on one condition: her past and her first child must remain a secret forever. His father had built his life, and Leo's on that foundational lie. The kindness he showed Clara's adoptive father years later was not random. It was a guilty man's attempt at penance. As Clara's condition slowly, miraculously began to stabilize, Leo knew he had to face the parents who had raised her, the people he had indirectly helped to ruin. He went to their small bookstore, not as a CEO, but as a penitent. He found Clara's mother behind the counter. He didn't offer money, he didn't make excuses. He simply told her the truth he had discovered. He told her who he was. And then, the powerful titan of industry, in the quiet, dusty bookstore, bowed. He bowed in the traditional, deepest form of respect and apology, his forehead almost touching the floor. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice breaking, "for the pain I caused you, for the pain I caused your daughter, my sister." Clara's mother, a woman of quiet strength, looked at the broken man before her. She had every reason to hate him, but she saw only the profound, soul-shattering weight of his regret. She could not offer him forgiveness. That was not hers to give, but she could offer him a sliver of grace. "My daughter," she said, her voice soft but firm, "is a fighter. She survived you once. She will survive this. What you do now, that will determine the man you truly are." He left the bookstore, not absolved, but with a new, clear purpose. His quest was no longer for forgiveness. It was to become a man worthy of the sister he had almost lost. If you believe his regret is the first step toward healing, comment regret. Clara's recovery was a slow, arduous journey back to the light. When she was finally moved from the intensive care unit to a private room, the first person she saw, sitting quietly in the corner, was Leo. Her memory of the events leading up to the surgery was hazy, a fog of pain and fever. Her first instinct, honed by years of conflict, was one of defense. But the man in the chair was not the corporate predator she remembered. He looked diminished. The sharp, confident edges of his arrogance had been worn away, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it seemed etched into his bones. He didn't rush to her with apologies or explanations. He simply moved to her bedside. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual authority. "Like I was run over by a truck," she whispered, her throat dry. He poured her a glass of water, his hand steady, and helped her take a sip. For the first few days, this was the rhythm of their interactions. He was a constant, silent presence. He read to her from books he found in the hospital gift shop, his voice a low, even monotone. He peeled apples for her with a surprising meticulousness. He spoke with her doctors, translating the complex medical jargon into simple terms she could understand. He was not acting like a CEO or an ex-husband. He was acting like a brother. As her strength returned, so did her memory, and with it the questions. "Leo, what happened?" she asked one afternoon. "What am I still doing here?" He took a deep breath, the moment he had been dreading and preparing for. He didn't try to soften the blow. He simply laid out the truth, starting with the file the nurse had given him. He told her about their mother, about the adoption, about the secret his father had kept for his entire life. He watched her face as he spoke, saw the disbelief, the confusion, and then the slow, dawning horror of understanding. The revelation was a quiet explosion, rearranging the entire landscape of her life. The animosity she felt for him, the sense of being an outsider in his world, it was all cast in a new, tragic light. They were not enemies separated by class and circumstance. They were siblings, separated by a lie. The pain of this new truth was immense, but it was a shared pain. For the first time, they were not on opposite sides of a conflict. They were two victims of the same family tragedy. The anger she had held for him for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a complex sorrow. She wasn't just grieving for herself, but for him, for the brother she never had, for the man who had been forced to carry the weight of a legacy built on a secret. "All that time," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All that time, my fight was with my own family." "No," he said, his own voice thick with emotion as he reached out and for the first time took her hand. "Your fight was with me. I was the one who was too blind to see you. I was the one who chose the lie over the truth. That is my sin to carry, Clara. Not yours." That was the turning point. The healing began not with a grand gesture of forgiveness, but with a shared acknowledgement of their brokenness. In the weeks of her recovery that followed, they began to rebuild, not a marriage, but something far more fundamental, a family. He brought old photo albums from his father's house, and together they looked for traces of their mother's smile in their own faces. She told him stories about her childhood, about growing up in the bookstore, about the quiet kindness of the parents who raised her. He, in turn, told her about the crushing loneliness of his own upbringing, the pressure to be the perfect heir, the emotional void his father could never fill. He did not just apologize with words, he demonstrated his remorse with actions. He personally oversaw the dissolution of his professional relationship with Serena, ensuring she was removed from Orion Corporation with a severance package that was legally correct but publicly humiliating in its minimalism. He then used his considerable resources to track down Julian Croft, the programmer whose stolen code was the foundation of Orion's success. He flew to the small remote town where Croft was living in obscurity, and he didn't send a lawyer. He went himself. He confessed everything, returned the intellectual property rights, and established a multi-million-dollar fund in Croft's name to compensate him for the lost years, an act that sent shockwaves through the tech industry. He was cleaning his own house, atoning for the sins of his father and himself, one action at a time. Through these acts, he wasn't just trying to earn Clara's forgiveness. He was trying to become a man she could be proud to call her brother. Just as a fragile sense of peace began to settle over their new reality, the past returned with a vengeance. Serena, stripped of her power and prestige, was not a woman to fade into obscurity. She was consumed by a burning rage, not just at Leo for casting her aside, but at Clara, the woman she saw as the source of her downfall. From her exile, she plotted her final, devastating move. She knew that simply attacking Orion Corporation financially would no longer hurt Leo. His priorities had shifted. To truly destroy him, she had to destroy the one thing he now valued above all else: his relationship with his newfound sister. Serena still held the ultimate weapon, the original unredacted proof of how Leo's father had stolen Julian Croft's technology. While Leo had confessed and made restitution to Croft, the story had been managed by his PR team as a dispute resolution. The ugliest details, the ones that painted his father not just as an opportunist, but as a cruel predator who threatened Croft's family, had never come to light. Serena decided to detonate this bomb, but with a vicious twist. She would frame Clara for the leak. Her plan was a masterpiece of treachery. She used her remaining contacts to hack into the Aegis Foundation's servers, a system Clara had set up with limited resources. She then fabricated a digital trail, planting evidence that made it look as if Clara, in her role as the Foundation's director, had illegally obtained these sensitive documents and was planning to leak them to the press in a final act of revenge against the brother who had once wronged her. To make the frame-up perfect, Serena then leaked the documents herself to every major news outlet, an anonymous whistleblower exposing the truth about both Orion's past and Clara's supposed present-day treachery. The scandal was immediate and catastrophic. The story exploded, but the focus wasn't on the sins of Leo's father. It was on the supposed hypocrisy and malice of his sister. The headlines were brutal. Iris uses charity as weapon in family feud. The angel of justice or a devil in disguise. The public, which had been sympathetic to Clara, now saw her as a bitter, manipulative woman, using her foundation for a personal vendetta. The Aegis Foundation was thrown into crisis, its reputation in tatters, its donors pulling their funding. Clara, who had just begun to heal, was suddenly isolated and under attack from all sides, accused of the very kind of malicious behavior she had fought against. Leo saw the news and knew with absolute certainty that it was Serena's handiwork. His first instinct was a white-hot rage, but his second overriding instinct was protection. He raced to Clara's small office, finding her surrounded by ringing phones and accusatory emails, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a defiant fury. "It wasn't me, Leo," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I know," he said, his voice a rock of certainty in her storm, "and we are going to fight this together." In that moment, they ceased to be a recovering family and became a unified fighting force. The skills that had once made them formidable opponents now made them an unstoppable team. Leo, the master strategist, took charge of the technical battle. He brought in his elite cybersecurity team from Orion, not to defend his company, but to defend his sisters. They worked around the clock, tracing the digital footprints of the hack, following the breadcrumbs back to their source. Clara, the master of justice and ethics, took charge of the public battle. She refused to hide. She called a press conference. Standing before the same reporters who were crucifying her, she did not get defensive. With Leo standing silently but resolutely behind her, she laid out the mission of the Aegis Foundation. She spoke of its cases, of the people it had helped. She then looked directly into the cameras. "The work we do at Aegis is built on one principle: the truth. The documents that were leaked about Orion's past are true, and they speak to a painful history that my brother has worked tirelessly to rectify. However, the story that I was behind that leak is a malicious lie, designed by those who fear the truth, and we will not be silenced by lies." Her strength and transparency were a powerful counter-narrative. As she spoke, Leo's team had a breakthrough. They traced the hack to a server farm in Eastern Europe, but more importantly, they found a hidden financial transaction, a large anonymous payment made to the server company from a shell corporation. It took them another 12 hours of relentless digging, but they finally peeled back the layers of the shell corporation. It was owned by none other than Serena. They had their proof. The final battle was set. Leo and Clara, brother and sister, stood side by side, no longer defined by the secrets of their parents, but by their shared commitment to the truth. They had faced the final threat, not as individuals, but as a family, their bond forged in the fire of a crisis and emerging as something unbreakable. The press conference was a masterstroke of strategy and heart. Clara's unwavering integrity, combined with Leo's silent, powerful support, began to turn the tide of public opinion. The final blow to Serena's scheme came the following day. Armed with the irrefutable proof of the hack and the financial transactions, Leo and Clara didn't just leak the information, they presented it in a formal complaint to the prosecutor's office. The investigation into Serena was swift and decisive, leading to charges of corporate sabotage, wire fraud, and perjury. Her downfall was as spectacular as it was deserved, a final, definitive end to the chaos she had wrought. With the external enemy defeated, a new profound silence settled between Leo and Clara. The crisis had not just solidified their bond as siblings, it had exposed the depth of their connection, a fierce loyalty and a profound care for each other that transcended family ties. They had been to war and back, and in the quiet aftermath, they found themselves looking at each other in a new light. The roles of brother and sister, which they had just begun to inhabit, suddenly felt incomplete. There was a pull, an unspoken understanding, a current of emotion running between them that was far more complex and romantic than either of them had anticipated. Leo was the first to recognize it for what it was. He, who had spent his life in a world of cold transactions, found himself hopelessly in love with the woman he now knew to be his sister. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. It explained his obsession, his admiration, his desperate need to protect her. But it also seemed like a love that was doomed from the start, a beautiful, tragic flower blooming in a poisoned garden. He knew, however, that the greatest lie of their lives had been the secret of their family. He would not build their future on another one. He chose a place that held the weight of their entire story, the quiet, dusty bookstore owned by her adoptive parents, the place where she had grown up, and the place where he had offered his first true apology. He asked her to meet him there after closing time. The store was dimly lit, the smell of old paper and ink hanging in the air. "I need to tell you the truth, Clara," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of his confession. The complete truth. He told her everything. He spoke of his cold, loveless marriage, of how he had seen her as a possession. Then he spoke of her return, of his obsession, of the grudging respect that grew into admiration. "And then," he said, his eyes locking with hers, "when I found out you were my sister, I thought the feeling I had was relief, a brother's love, a desire to protect. But it was more than that. It is more than that." He took a shaky breath. "I know this is impossible. I know the world would call it madness. But my father and your mother lived their lives trapped by secrets and duties. They sacrificed their happiness for the sake of appearances. I will not make that same mistake. I love you, Clara, not as a brother loves a sister. I love you as a man loves a woman. I love the woman you were, the woman you have become, and everything in between." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she listened. She had been fighting the same feelings herself. The confusing, overwhelming affection she felt for him that seemed to go beyond the familial. His confession was not a shock. It was a reflection of her own heart. "Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what are we supposed to do?" "We choose," he said, taking a step closer. "We choose to be happy. We choose to live in the truth. All of it." He did not have a ring. He did not get on one knee. His proposal was not one of marriage in the traditional sense, for their situation was anything but. His proposal was one of partnership, a commitment to face the world together, whatever their relationship would be called. "I am not your half-brother by a lie, and you are not my ex-wife by a contract," he said, his voice full of a conviction that seemed to remake the world around them. "We are two people who found each other through a storm. Will you be my partner, Clara? My partner in life, in love, in everything? Will you build a new story with me, one that is entirely our own?" She didn't need to speak. Her answer was in the way she closed the small distance between them and for the first time initiated the touch. She placed her hand on his cheek, a gesture of acceptance, of forgiveness, and of a love that had, against all odds, found its truth. In the quiet sanctuary of the bookstore, surrounded by the stories of others, they finally began to write their own. If this unconventional love story touched your heart, comment love. 5 years later. The scene is not a grand mansion or a corporate high-rise, but a beautiful modern home built on a cliff overlooking the sea. The architecture is a blend of glass, wood, and stone, a testament to a life that embraces both transparency and strength. In a sun-drenched living room filled with books and art, a small boy with Leo's dark hair and Clara's thoughtful eyes is building an elaborate city out of blocks. This is Julian, their 4-year-old son, named in honor of the man whose stolen legacy started their journey toward the truth. Clara, now a renowned philanthropist who transformed the Aegis Foundation into a global force for corporate accountability, sits on the floor with him offering architectural advice. She has found the perfect balance, using her sharp mind not for battle, but for building a better world. Leo enters from the terrace, carrying a tray with glasses of lemonade. He is no longer the CEO of Orion. After stabilizing the company, he and Clara had worked together to transition it into an employee-owned trust, a revolutionary move that made headlines. He now manages their family's joint foundation, a quiet, fulfilling life far from the ruthless world he once dominated. Their relationship is not one they hide, but they don't flaunt it either. They are simply Leo and Clara, a devoted couple whose complicated backstory is known to few. To the world, they are a powerful philanthropic team. To those who know them, they are a testament to the fact that love can be found in the most unexpected of places. He sits down on the floor, joining the construction project. He catches Clara's eye over the top of their son's head, and they share a silent smile, a smile full of shared history, understanding, and a deep, abiding peace. Their happily ever after is not a fairy tale. It is a conscious choice they make every day. It is a quiet life, built on the foundations of a tumultuous past. It is a testament to the idea that family is not always defined by blood, but by sacrifice, loyalty, and a love that is brave enough to defy convention. The narrator closes with a calm, thoughtful voice. Sometimes the greatest betrayals are not committed by our enemies, but by the secrets our families keep. The story of Leo and Clara teaches us that the path to redemption is paved with truth, no matter how painful. They were born from a secret, separated by a lie and reunited by a sacrifice. They discovered that love is not about following the rules, but about writing your own. Theirs was a love story that started with a divorce, was forged in a hospital, and was finally defined not by who they were supposed to be, but by who they chose to be, a family, against all odds. The final shot is of the three of them, a tight-knit unit, their heads bent together over the city of blocks, creating their own small, perfect world together. If this story moved you, share it now and type "shared" in the comments below. End